There are things out there. Creatures, monsters, ghouls and spirits. Beings that fall outside the realm of visible truth, beyond the confines of our basic reality. They lurk in the dark, haunt the recesses of our minds, and stir our curiosity in the unusual and weird. They are taboo topics, stories that we tell around the campfire and folklore passed down from our ancestors. We've been taught that these things don't exist, that they are merely myth and legend. Or are they? Welcome to the Occult Archives. I'm your host and spooky librarian, E.M. Moon, but feel free to refer to me as E. Here lies a space beyond all spaces, a library full of arcane information enough to drive any normal person mad. If you can think of it, if you can question it, the archives probably have what you seek. Tonight's episode focuses on another case investigated by the famous supernatural duo and married couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, the Enfield haunting. Many of you have most likely seen the Conjuring movies, and this particular case was used to create the story for The Conjuring 2 that hit theaters in 2016. A synopsis for the film reads, in 1977, paranormal investigators Ed, played by Patrick Wilson, and Lorraine Warren come out of a self-imposed sabbatical to travel to Enfield, a borough in North London. There they meet Peggy Hodgson, an overwhelmed single mother of 4, who tells the couple that something evil is in her home. Ed and Lorraine believe her story when the youngest daughter starts to show signs of demonic possession. As the Warrens try to help the besieged girl, they become the next targets of the malicious spirit. While the movie is based on the case that happened on Green Street in London, England, it is obviously embellished and many liberties were taken to create an intense horror film, but supposedly the actual truth was just as scary, if not more horrifying. But was it actually demonic possession or poltergeist activity? Let's have a little occult history lesson and talk a bit about what a poltergeist actually is. And no, it's nothing like the 1982 movie or its subsequent sequels, all of which are some of my favorites. In German folklore and ghost lore, a poltergeist, or in German, rumbling ghost or noisy spirit, is a type of ghost or spirit that is responsible for physical disturbances, such as loud noises and objects being moved or destroyed. Most claims or fictional descriptions of poltergeists show them as being capable of pinching, biting, hitting, and tripping people. They are also depicted as capable of the movement or levitation of objects such as furniture and cutlery, or noises such as knocking on doors. Foul smells are also associated with poltergeist occurrences, as well as spontaneous fires and different electrical issues such as flickering lights. These manifestations have been recorded in many cultures and countries, including Brazil, Australia, the United States, Japan, and most European nations. The first recorded case dates back to the 1st century. The word poltergeist comes from the German language word poltern, to make sound, to rumble, and Geist, which obviously is ghost or spirit. And then the term itself translates as noisy ghost, rumble ghost, or a loud spirit. A synonym coined by René Sudre is thoribism, from the ancient Greek thorobene, to make noise or uproar, to throw into confusion. As always, there have been suggested explanations for things like this. Many claims have been made that poltergeist activity explains strange events, including those by modern self-styled ghost hunters. However, their evidence has so far not stood up to scrutiny. Many claimed poltergeist events have been proven upon investigation to be hoaxes. Psychical researcher Frank Podmore proposed the naughty little girl theory for poltergeist cases, many of which have seemed to center on an adolescent, usually a girl. He found that the center of the disturbances was often a child who was throwing objects around to fool or scare people for attention. Skeptical investigator Joe Nickel says that claimed poltergeist incidents typically originate from an individual who is motivated to cause mischief. According to Nickel, in the typical poltergeist outbreak, small objects are hurled through the air by unseen forces, furniture is overturned, or other disturbances occur. Usually just what could be accomplished by a juvenile trickster determined to plague credulous adults. Nickel writes that reports are often exaggerated by credulous witnesses. Time and time again in other poltergeist outbreaks, witnesses have reported an object leaping from its resting place, supposedly on its own. when it is likely that the perpetrator had secretly obtained the object sometime earlier and waited for an opportunity to fling it, even from outside the room, thus supposedly proving he or she was innocent. A few unsubstantiated claims are as follows. The Stockwell ghost in 1772, Balshan House in 1876, the subject of tonight's episode, the Enfield Poltergeist claim of 1977, John Beloff, a former president of the Society for Psychical Research, and Anita Gregory concluded that the claimants were playing tricks on the investigators, and then the Columbus Poltergeist case of 1984. Could this be psychological? A claim of activity at Caledonia Mills, 1899 to 1922, was investigated by Walter Franklin Prince, research officer for the American Society for Psychical Research in 1922. Prince concluded that the mysterious fires and alleged poltergeist phenomena were because of a psychological state of dissociation. Nandor Fodor investigated the Thornton Health poltergeist claim in 1938. His conclusion of the case were a psychoanalytical explanation, and in a subsequent publication, the poltergeist is not a ghost. It is a bundle of projected repressions. According to research in anomalistic psychology, claims of poltergeist activity can be explained by psychological factors such as illusion, memory lapses, and wishful thinking. A study, Lang and Haran 1998, wrote that poltergeist experiences are delusions resulting from the affective and cognitive dynamics of percipients' interpretation of ambiguous stimuli. Psychologist Donovan Rawcliffe has written that almost all poltergeist cases that have been investigated turned out to be based on trickery, whilst the rest are attributable to psychological factors such as hallucinations. Psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung was interested in the concept of poltergeists and the occult in general. Jung believed that a female cousin's trance states were responsible for a dining table splitting in two and his later discovery of a broken bread knife. Jung also believed that when a bookcase gave an explosive cracking sound during a meeting with Sigmund Freud in 1909, he correctly predicted that there would be a second sound, speculating that such phenomena were caused by exteriorization of his subconscious mind. Freud disagreed and concluded that there was some natural cause. Freud biographers maintained the sounds were likely caused by the wood of the bookcase contracting as it dried out. In other instances, poltergeist activity could be contributed to unverified natural phenomena. Attempts have also been made to scientifically explain poltergeist disturbances that have not been traced to fraud or psychological factors. Skeptic and magician Milbourne Christopher found that some cases of poltergeist activity can be attributed to unusual air currents, such as a 1957 case on Cape Cod, where downdrafts from an uncovered chimney became strong enough to blow a mirror off a wall, overturn chairs, and knock things off shelves. In the 1950s, Guy William Lambert proposed that reported poltergeist phenomena could be explained by the movement of underground water causing stress on houses. He suggested that water turbulence could cause strange sounds or a structural movement of the property, possibly causing the house to vibrate and move objects. Later researchers such as Alan Gauld and Tony Cornell tested Lambert's hypothesis by placing specific objects in different rooms and subjecting the house to strong mechanical vibrations. They discovered that although the structure of the building had been damaged, only a few of the objects moved a very short distance. The skeptic Trevor H. Hall criticized the hypothesis, claiming if it was true, the building would almost certainly fall into ruins. According to Richard Wiseman, the hypothesis has not held up to scrutiny. Michael Persinger has theorized that seismic activity could cause poltergeist phenomena. However, Persinger's claims regarding the effects of environmental geomagnetic activity on paranormal experiences have not been independently replicated and, like his findings regarding the God helmet, may simply be explained by the suggestibility of participants. David Turner, a retired physical chemist, suggested that ball lightning might cause the spooky movement of objects blamed on poltergeists. In a case from 1810 to 1811, Sampford Peveril, it was found that poltergeistal noises were determined to be made by smugglers from behind a false wall. Now we come to the potential paranormal explanation. Parapsychologist Nandor Fodor and William G. Roll suggested that poltergeist activity can be explained by psychokinesis. Historically, actual malicious spirits were blamed for apparent poltergeist-type activity, such as objects moving seemingly of their own accord. According to Alan Kardec, the founder of Spiritism, poltergeists are manifestations of disembodied spirits of low level, belonging to the 6th class of the 3rd order. Under this explanation, they are believed to be closely associated with the elements: fire, air, water, and earth. In Finland, somewhat famous are the case of the, I'm going to screw this up, Macula ghost, in 1946, which received attention in the press at the time, and the Devils of Martin in, here's another word I'm going to have a hard time saying, Joljärvi, in the late 19th century, for which affidavits were obtained in court. Samuli Palaharju has also recorded a memoir of a typical poltergeist, the case of Salko Nilla, from the south of Lake Inari, in his book Memoirs of Lapland. The story has also been published in the collection of mythical stories edited by Laurie Simon Surrey. Now that you know a little bit more about what a poltergeist is, let's get into the meat of this episode and the claims made by the Hodgson family back in 1977. A brief introduction of the Enfield Poltergeist was that it was a claim of supernatural activity at 284 Green Street, a council house in Brimsdown, Enfield, London, England, between 1977 and 1979. The alleged poltergeist activity centered on sisters Janet, aged 11, and Margaret Hodgson, aged 13. Some members of the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, such as inventor Maurice Grosse and writer Guy Lyon Playfair, believed the haunting to be genuine, while others such as Anita Gregory and John Beloff were unconvinced and found evidence the girls had faked incidents for the benefit of journalists. Members of the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, CSICOP, including stage magicians such as Milbourne Christopher and Joe Nickel, criticized paranormal investigators for being credulous, whilst also identifying elements of the case as being indicative of a hoax. The story attracted press coverage in British newspapers, has been mentioned in books, featured in television and radio documentaries, and dramatized in the 2016 horror film The Conjuring 2. In August 1977, single mother Peggy Hodgson called the Metropolitan Police to her rented home at 284 Green Street in Enfield, London, saying she had witnessed furniture moving and that 2 of her 4 children had heard knocking sounds on the walls. The children included Janet, aged 11, and Margaret, aged 13. A police constable reported witnessing a chair wobble and slide, but could not determine the cause of the movement. Later claims included disembodied voices, loud noises, thrown toys, overturned chairs, and children levitating. Over a period of 18 months, more than 30 people, including the Hodgsons' neighbors, paranormal investigators, and journalists, said they variously saw heavy furniture moving of its own accord, objects being thrown across a room, and the sisters seeming to levitate several feet off the ground. Many also heard and recorded knocking noises and a gruff voice. The story was regularly covered in the Daily Mirror newspaper until reports came to an end in 1979. Paranormal investigations kicked off with the Society for Psychical Research members Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair reporting curious whistling and barking noises coming from Janet's general direction. Although Playfair maintained the paranormal activity was genuine and wrote in his later book This House is Haunted, The True Story of a Poltergeist in 1980, that an entity was to blame for the Enfield disturbances, he often doubted the children's veracity and wondered if they were playing tricks and exaggerating. Still, Grosse and Playfair believed that, even though some of the alleged poltergeist activity was faked by the girls, other incidents were genuine. Other paranormal investigators who visited the Enfield house included American demonologist Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were convinced that the events had a supernatural explanation. According to Brian Dunning, the Warrens' visit was short. Ed Warren tried to persuade Playfair that money could be made from this case by writing books and selling movie rights, and then the Warrens left. Janet was detected in trickery. A video camera in an adjoining room caught her bending spoons and attempting to bend an iron bar. Grosse had observed Janet banging a broom handle on the ceiling and hiding his tape recorder. According to Playfair, one of Janet's voices, whom she called Bill, displayed a habit of suddenly changing the topic. It was a habit Janet also had. When Janet and Margaret admitted pranking to journalists, Grosse and Playfair compelled the girls to retract their confessions. The 2 men were mocked by other researchers for being easily duped. Psychical researcher Renee Haynes noted that doubts were raised about the alleged poltergeist voice at the SPR conference at Cambridge in 1978, where the video cassettes from Enfield were examined. SPR investigator Anita Gregory stated the Enfield case had been overrated, characterizing several episodes of the girls' behavior as suspicious, and speculated that the girls had staged some incidents for the benefit of journalists seeking a sensational story. John Beloff, a former president of the SPR, investigated and suggested Janet was practicing ventriloquism. Both Beloff and Gregory came to the conclusion that Janet and Margaret were playing tricks on the investigators. Milbourne Christopher, an American stage magician, briefly investigated the Enfield occurrences and failed to observe anything that could be called paranormal. He was dismayed by what he felt was suspicious activity on the part of Janet, later concluding that the poltergeist was nothing more than the antics of a little girl who wanted to cause trouble and who was very, very clever. Ventriloquist Ray Allen visited the house and concluded that Janet's male voices were simply vocal tricks. Of course, many skeptical interpretations were made. Skeptic Joe Nickel of the U.S.-based Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal examined the findings of paranormal investigators and criticized them for being overly credulous. When a supposedly disembodied demonic voice was heard, Playfair noted that, as always, Janet's lips hardly seemed to be moving. He states that a remote-controlled still camera, the photographer was not present in the room with the girls, timed to take a picture every 15 seconds was shown by investigator Melvin Harris to reveal pranking by the girls. He argues that a photo allegedly depicting Janet levitating actually shows her bouncing off the bed as if it were a trampoline. Harris called the photos examples of common gymnastics and said, "It's worth remembering that Janet was a school sports champion." Nickel pointed out that a tape recorder malfunction that Gross attributed to supernatural activity, and SPR President David Fontana described as an occurrence which appeared to defy the laws of mechanics, was a peculiar threading jam occurring with older model reel-to-reel tape recorders. He also said that Ed Warren was notorious for exaggerating and even making up incidents in such cases, often transforming a haunting case into one of demonic possession. In 2015, Deborah Hyde commented that there was no solid evidence for the Enfield poltergeist. The first thing to note is that the occurrences didn't happen under controlled circumstances. People frequently see what they expect to see, their senses being organized and shaped by their prior experiences and beliefs. Skeptics have argued that the alleged poltergeist voice that originated from Janet was produced by false vocal cords above the larynx and had the phraseology and vocabulary of a child. In a television interview for BBC Scotland, Janet was observed to gain attention by waving her hand and then putting her hand in front of her mouth while a claimed disembodied voice was heard. During the interview, both girls were asked the question, "How does it feel to be haunted by a poltergeist?" Janet replied, "It's not haunted." And Margaret, in a hushed tone, interrupted, "Shut up." Skeptics have regarded these factors as evidence against the case. As a magician experienced in the dynamics of trickery, Nickel examined Playfair's account and contemporary press clippings. He noted that the supposed poltergeist tended to act only when it was not being watched, and concluded that the incidents were best explained as children's pranks. Although Gross made tape recordings of Janet and believed no trickery was involved, the magician Bob Coty said, "He made some of the recordings available to me, and, having listened to them very carefully, I came to the conclusion that there was nothing in what I had heard that was beyond the capabilities of an imaginative teenager." All of the recordings have been cataloged and digitized by the SPR, and a book of their content, the Enfield Poltergeist tapes, White Crow, was produced by Dr. Melvin Willen in 2019. A 2016 article by psychology professor Chris French in Time Out magazine described 5 reasons why he believed the case to have been a hoax. His reasons are: the 2 sisters involved admitted to hoaxing some of the activity. The photo of Janet levitating above her bed could just as easily be explained as Janet jumping. The spirit of an old man who supposedly possessed Janet took a great deal of interest in menstruation. Eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable, and other schoolgirl pranks before and after have gotten out of hand. I scrounged up a few articles written fairly recently about the case and figured I would give them a read and see what they have to say about the now infamous poltergeist activity. An article in People written by Jody Guglielmi, titled "The Enfield Poltergeist: Inside the Real Story That Inspired The Conjuring 2, reads, "While some question its authenticity, others consider this one of the most witnessed cases of supernatural activity. The Conjuring 2 gave horror-philes a chance to enter the House of Strange Happenings, even if it was just on the big screen. The 2016 film stars Madison Wolfe, Vera Farmiga, and Patrick Wilson, and focuses on one of the most infamous supernatural cases in history, the Enfield Poltergeist. The story of a young girl thought to be possessed by a demon inside her London home mystified a nation. The case involved strange voices, levitation, flying objects, furniture moving through the air, cold breezes, and more. And while some called it a hoax, plenty of others are convinced it's one of the most compelling supernatural cases ever documented." So what really happened during the case of the Enfield Poltergeist? Here's an inside look at the real story that inspired The Conjuring 2. Peggy Hodgson first heard odd noises from her daughter's bedroom. It all started in a quaint little home in Enfield, London in 1977, when Peggy Hodgson, a single mother of 4 children, heard loud noises coming from her daughter's bedroom. When she went to tell her daughters Margaret, then 13, and Janet, then 11, to settle down and go to sleep instead of roughhousing, she found them huddled in the corner with terrified expressions on their faces. "We told our mom the chest of drawers was moving toward the bedroom door," Janet recalled while speaking on ITV1 in 2012. She said, "Oh, don't be silly." But then Hodgson witnessed the drawers moving toward the door by a seemingly invisible force, almost as if some supernatural presence was trying to trap the girls in the room. When she tried to push back against the dresser, it wouldn't budge. Terrified, the Hodgson family ran across the street to ask for help from their neighbors, Vic and Peggy Nottingham. When Vic went into the house to investigate, he too said he heard strange noises coming from around the home. The Hodgsons called the police, and even though one officer claimed to have seen a chair move clear across the room, they deduced that it was not a police matter. According to the family, that was just the beginning of what would become their nearly 18-month haunting. The Hodgson family's haunting lasted a year and a half. "We didn't understand what was happening," Margaret told People at the Conjuring 2 premiere in Los Angeles in 2016. "We went through periods where we just couldn't believe what happened, really. It's frightening. We didn't like to be on our own in the house or anything." When the strange incidents continued, the Hodgsons decided to call a popular UK publication, the Daily Mirror, to come and investigate the supposed supernatural occurrences. But when the reporter arrived, the house sat silent for hours. It wasn't until the reporter was about to leave that something happened. The photographer came back, and a Lego brick hit him above the eye. He still had the mark a few days later. And then Maurice Grosse came in on the case, Janet said, the Telegraph reported. The Daily Mirror called the Society for Psychical Research, who sent Grosse to investigate the case. During his stay at the house, Grosse has said he witnessed more than 2,000 incidents of supernatural activity. Furniture turning over, cups filled with water, fires igniting, voices, levitation, Janet recalled to ITV1 in 2012. "The most frightening encounter was when a curtain wrapped itself around my neck next to the bed." It was during his time in the house that the supposed poltergeist started speaking through Janet. Janet Hodgson claimed she was possessed. Janet would often go into a trance-like state where she would speak in a deep, scratchy voice, claiming to be the ghost of a man named Bill Wilkins, who had died in the house years before. It was later proven that a man by that name was once a resident of the home and did die of a hemorrhage while sitting in the living room. Janet claimed the ghost would talk through her for hours at a time. Throughout the 18-month experience, several additional paranormal researchers visited the house, including famed demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. Though the 2016 film takes liberties with time and the extent to which the Warrens were involved with the case, they publicly stated that they were convinced that the supernatural was responsible for the strange happenings inside the house. "Those who deal with the supernatural day in and day out know the phenomena are there. There's no doubt about it," Ed said, according to All That's Interesting. Janet Hodgson admitted to faking some supernatural incidents. Of course, many cast their doubts on the events, claiming the children were behind the elaborate hoax and were faking their demonic symptoms. 2 SPR experts adamantly questioned Janet's gruff voice and later caught the children bending spoons themselves. In fact, Janet admitted that she and her siblings fabricated a few events. "Oh yeah, once or twice we faked phenomena, just to see if Mr. Gross and Mr. Playfair would catch us," she told ITV News in 1980, per the Daily Mail. They always did. She later told the outlet that 2% of the events in the house were faked. Even after all this time, Janet and Margaret said that while they've managed to move on from that traumatic time, the haunting stays with you. Every step of the way, Margaret told people at the Conjuring 2 premiere in Los Angeles in 2016. It's just like a death, really. It gets a little bit easier as time goes on. But the fear and the memories of it and what happened never leave you. Another article from BBC written by Natasha Tripney, titled, "The Enfield Poltergeist, Why the Unexplained Mystery That Shocked 1970s Britain Continues to Disturb." In 1977, reports of supposedly paranormal goings-on in a North London house made headlines. And with a new TV series in play about events, they still confound, writes Natasha Tripney. In August 1977, the police arrived at 284 Green Street in the North London suburb of Enfield. Peggy Hodgson, a single mother of 4, reported that her 2 young daughters, Janet aged 11 and older sister Margaret, had heard strange knocking. The source of the sound could not be determined. They called in the neighbors who were also disturbed by what they heard. Out of desperation, they rang the police, one of whom reportedly saw a chair move of its own accord. Next, they turned to the press. Over the next 18 months, stories of increasingly strange phenomena emerged from the house. Furniture was hurled across the rooms. There were reports of paranormal whistling, and most unsettling of all, Janet Hodgson was heard to talk with the rasping voice of an old man. The case came to the attention of the Society for Psychical Research, and 2 of its members, inventor-turned-paranormal investigator Maurice Grosse and writer Guy Lyon Playfair, were sent to investigate. Playfair would later publish a book, This House is Haunted, about the experiences. Eventually, events in the house just stopped, but not before Janet spent time in London's Maudsley Psychiatric Hospital. She is still clearly affected by happenings in the house. "I know what I experienced. I know it was real," she says in a new Apple TV Plus 4-part drama documentary series about the phenomenon. "It follows you. It has never left me." In the years since, the events in that Enfield Council house have remained a source of fascination. There have been numerous retellings and adaptations of the so-called Enfield Poltergeist, including a 2015 TV drama, The Enfield Haunting, which starred Timothy Spall as Gross and a pre-Succession Matthew McFadden as Playfair, and Hollywood blockbuster The Conjuring 2, which dispatched its lead duo, American paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, to North London. Why it's back in the spotlight. Now a new play about the bizarre phenomenon written by Paul Unwin, creator of long-running UK medical drama Casualty, and starring Catherine Tate and David Threlfall, is set to premiere. Also called The Enfield Haunting, it will open in London's West End in November. Meanwhile, the Apple TV Plus series painstakingly recreates the interior of the Green Street house and weaves together visual enactments of audio recordings made by Gross at the time and interviews with people who were there. Unwin's interest in the case began 11 years ago when he was introduced to Playfair as they shared an agent. "I met this extraordinary man who told me this very peculiar story," he tells BBC Culture. Unwin visited the writer's basement flat in Earl's Court, and Playfair played him some of the tapes he'd recorded in the house. At first, Unwin was unconvinced. It sounded to him like children shouting and playing games. But the more he listened, the more questions he had. "Emotions are not simple. It can be very easy to become committed to stuff that isn't necessarily true," Paul Unwin was quoted. He has his own ideas about what happened in the house. The story of the Enfield Haunting can be understood on different levels, he explains. It's important to remember, he says, that the late 1970s was quite an odd, intense period, with the UK in political and economic turmoil. The family had just gone through a divorce and were living in considerable poverty, so he understands how 2 young girls might become possessed by the circumstances in which they found themselves, swept along by events that quickly became bigger than them. "Emotions are not simple," he says. "It can be very easy to become committed to stuff that isn't necessarily true." He makes a connection between what happened in Enfield and the anti-vax and QAnon movements. However, he adds, he does not discount a supernatural explanation for at least some of what went on there. There are some things about the story, he says, that really don't make sense. Unwin stresses that his play is not a documentary. It's an imagined response to those events. The play is a taut 90 minutes and takes place on one night in 1978, after events had been going on for some time. I've aligned a lot of things that happened over a period into that one night because it makes for good theater, he explains. His primary goal was not to spook an audience, but to present a deeper exploration of what was going on, to show the forces at work. At the same time, he is very conscious of the fact that, intentionally or otherwise, there was a degree of exploitation of the young girls in the Enfield case. I didn't want to be another male exploiting them, he says. In my exploration of the story, I tried to find an emotional truth for me and things that have happened in my own life. The impact it left. Why has this story proved so culturally enduring? Enfield is the archetypal British haunting, says Stephen Volk, writer of the iconic 1992 BBC show Ghost Watch, a faux reality TV show which was in part inspired by the Enfield Poltergeist. The familiarity and normality of the setting, with a normal working-class family in a normal house, not a stereotypical haunted mansion, made it more resonant. It wasn't a Hammer horror castle, he says. There were no clanking chains. In the 1970s, he explains with films like The Exorcist, horror was beginning to shift into more recognizable domestic spaces, in the US at least. There was more to relate to in Stephen King's Maine than in a lot of British horror. However, the events in Enfield echoed this new US model, taking place in a house that he says could easily be around the corner. Though pre-recorded Ghost Watch was presented as a live on-air investigation into mysterious events at the London home of the fictional Early family, with real-life television presenters including Michael Parkinson and Sarah Green hosting the show, and adding to the sense of veracity, I read everything I could get my hands on in terms of ghosts and hauntings, and formulated what I thought was a kind of an archetype of the way these things work, he says. In part inspired by the Enfield Poltergeist, Ghost Watch was water cooler television before the term entered the lexicon. It seemed incumbent on me to create a kind of fractured family, says Volk, though the family dynamics were based not on the Hodgsons, but on the Fox sisters, 19th century mediums who convinced people that they were communicating with spirits via strange rapping noises. Ghost Watch terrified audiences and resulted in outraged headlines in the tabloids, though it had since become a cult favorite. It was water cooler television before the term entered the lexicon and subverted the rules of reality TV before they'd been established. Playfair was credited as psychic consultant, and members of the SPR manned the phone lines that the audience was invited to call, at which point they were informed the show wasn't real. But the organization was not overly pleased with the resulting show, which they felt trivialized the science of parapsychology. For children watching at the time, however, it was seminal television, and says Volk, television is a kind of haunting. It's full of people that don't exist anymore. What really happened? The Apple TV Plus documentary shows that while Gross and Playfair were convinced that there was something otherworldly going on at 284 Green Street, other members of the SPR were harder to convince, including Anita Gregory, a lecturer in psychology who speculated that the presence of Gross, Playfair, and the media was contributing to the situation. Paranormal investigator Maurice Gross spent months at the house making audio recordings, among other things. Deborah Hyde, editor-in-chief of The Skeptic magazine, which promotes science and critical thinking, says we shouldn't underestimate the role that facilitators like Playfair played in both shaping the story and legitimizing it. Usually a facilitator is an educated, articulate man of a certain class background who has a stake in the story, she explains. There was a very clear facilitator in the case of the Fox sisters as well, she adds. And when they get involved, the story gets out of hand because it can get transmitted to other places. The case is part of the cultural fabric of the UK. I can't remember when I first encountered the story. I feel like it's always been in my memory. Quoted Danny Robbins. In 2011, Hyde appeared on This Morning alongside Playfair and Janet Hodgson in one of the latter's rare public appearances. Hodgson, Hyde believes, would undoubtedly have been better off if she could have left that chapter of her life behind long ago, but she wasn't able to because Playfair's identity depended on it. Playfair subsequently passed away in 2018, but the story has not died with him. Hyde ultimately believes the reason writers and documentary makers keep returning to Enfield is because it's easy to sell an existing IP. Enfield is part of the cultural fabric of the UK, says Danny Robbins, broadcaster, playwright, and creator of the hit supernatural podcast Uncanny and the Battersea Poltergeist, who is now also presenting a TV version of Uncanny on BBC Two. "I can't remember when I first encountered the story. I feel like it's always been in my memory," he tells BBC Culture. Part of the reason Enfield has proved so durable is because of the sheer volume of evidence we have of the case, Robbins says. Not just Gross and Playfair's recordings, but stills and audio footage from Daily Mirror photographer Graham Morris and the producers of the BBC radio documentary made at the time. Numerous eyewitnesses described items flying through the air and matches that spontaneously burst into flames. Morris himself described being hit by one of those objects. Robbins interviewed Morris about the experiences for the first episode of his Uncanny TV show. He was there at the beginning, capturing images and recording his own experiences, which are quite incredible. The BBC's infamous 1992 faux supernatural investigation show Ghostwatch borrowed the Enfield Poltergeist's British suburban setting. There's a huge amount of evidence there, which is something that is normally absent from paranormal cases, says Robbins. While people have referred to Enfield as one of the UK's most credible hauntings, he says, there's a case to be made that it's just the most photographed. The case also took place at the sweet spot, in Robbins' words, when there was a lot of public interest in ghosts, UFOs, and other unexplained phenomena, and when newspapers also had the resources to send journalists to investigate these cases. There was also a degree of public trust in the media that led the Hodgsons to call the paper for help. In general, when it comes to the supernatural, Robbins is neither believer nor skeptic, but approaches every case with an open mind, as he does, too, the Enfield Poltergeist. Enfield is a really murky, complicated, and deeply intriguing case, he says. Though Gross and Playfair had, he feels, the best intentions, their presence certainly created a very heightened sense of drama around it. But despite this, the case is clearly robust enough to deflect skeptic inquiry, he believes. For while there have been many convincing skeptic theories on it, none has been significant enough to completely debunk it in the same way that the Amityville haunting has been debunked in the US. Enfield remains culturally resonant, Robbins concludes, because it retains its mysteries. Obviously, the case of the Enfield Poltergeist has been popular for years and continues to be so, to the point that there have been various events in popular culture documenting the case or versions of the case. On the 26th of December 1978, BBC Radio 4 broadcast the documentary The Enfield Poltergeist by BBC reporter Rosalind Morris. Morris visited the Hodgson family on numerous occasions to make this documentary. In 1992, the BBC aired a controversial mockumentary titled Ghostwatch, as discussed before, written by Stephen Volk and based on the Enfield Poltergeist. I would actually love to watch this, and I feel like I found it somewhere at some point, but I lost it, so if I can find it, I will make sure to post a link somewhere so that any of you can watch it if you'd like. In March 2007, Channel 4 aired a documentary about the Enfield Poltergeist titled Interview with the Poltergeist. The Enfield Poltergeist has been featured in episodes of ITV series Strange But True and Extreme Ghost Stories. The Enfield Poltergeist was the subject of the 2015 Sky Living television series, The Enfield Haunting, which was broadcast from the 4th through the 17th of May 2015. I think I saw something about this being on Apple TV. Also, if I find that, I'll put the link up. The 2016 film The Conjuring 2 is based on Ed and Lorraine Warren's investigation of the case, and it's very loosely based, by the way. It's a good movie. I enjoy it. It's very well done, but it's not accurate at all to the case, in my opinion. They took a lot of liberties, let's put it that way. In 2018, the BBC Radio 4 program, The Reunion, presented by Stu McGregor, revisited the case with interviews with Richard Gross and Graham Morris. In 2023, a play titled The Enfield Haunting was announced, starring Catherine Tate, to be premiered at Theatre Royal, Brighton, and Richmond Theatre, before moving to the Ambassadors Theatre in London from the 30th of November 2023 to the 2nd of March 2024. On 27 of October 2023, Apple TV debuted the Enfield Poltergeist miniseries. Oh, here's the Apple TV one. Oops, not the other one. Filming the documentary in a recreated set of the allegedly haunted house at 284 Green Street, utilizing actors lip-syncing to original tape recordings, archival video footage, and modern-day interview with living witnesses of the events. So, what say you about this case of supposed poltergeist activity? Do we have enough evidence to make a deduction, or is more research needed? As usual, and as much as I love the idea of them and their research, we see that Ed and Lorraine Warren didn't have as much involvement in this case as advertised, and it was clearly sensationalized for publicity and monetary gain. Could the activities surrounding the Hodgsons have been true, Or was it all a hoax? Maybe a mixture of both? I guess it's left for us to decide if the science debunks the happenings and our imaginations have just run wild, or if the truth is actually far stranger than fiction. That's all for tonight's episode. If you'd like to support the archives, you can do so by visiting our Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/inkdrinkerarchives. If you're into witchy apothecary goodies, you can support us by purchasing some wares from our shop, inkdrinkerapothecary.storeenvy.com. From loose-leaf teas to delightful perfume oils and mystery goods like our blind date with the book boxes, there is pretty much something for every strange and unusual creature out there. You can also find the archives on most social media platforms at Ink Drinker Archives or the Occult Archives with author E.M. Moon on Facebook. As always, I'll leave you with this reminder. Lock your doors, salt your windows, and remember, it's okay to sleep with the lights on.